When Tiffany announced that 25 of her relatives were coming for Christmas, I told her 3 words: I'm going on vacation. She blinked like I had suggested an impossible thing. Kevin, who had been standing by the sink peeling something that looked suspiciously like responsibility, looked at me as if I had mispronounced a verb. Tiffany laughed, one of those practiced laughs that always arrives a beat after the moment it should have been funny, and said, "Margaret, you can't be serious. Who will cook? Who will set the table? You know my family." "I know your family," I said, and I kept my voice soft because I didn't want to make a scene. "And I know what they expect. I'm not their housekeeper." She tilted her head in that way she thought made her look diplomatic. "Come on, Mom, it's Christmas. It's only for a week. We'll help. Kevin will—" Kevin swallowed and went quiet. That was his role in our marriage now, the part that swallowed and went quiet. "What if I said I booked a room at the Seabird Inn for the week?" I asked. I watched Tiffany's face lose color, watched her recalibrate from entitlement to calculation. Kevin said, "Margaret, you can't—" "I already booked," I interrupted, "and I bought travel insurance. My suitcase is in the car." Tiffany's mouth opened and closed. There was a moment where I could see the gears turning, how to turn this into a favor owed, how to shift it back onto me. She was very practiced at that, at redirecting obligations like a magician moves cards. I felt a familiar heat behind my eyes that wasn't quite anger. It was years of being expected to make everything tidy for other people's lives, the casseroles, the folding chairs, the forgiveness. For 5 years, the house had been a catering hall with no tip jar, and something in me, old and sensible and very tired, simply refused for the 20th time to refill yet another pan. "You won't believe what I found in my son's office." That sentence felt both like a threat and like an explanation, and it was true, but I didn't tell them that yet. I packed my coat, kissed Kevin's forehead like I had kissed his as a child when the nightmares came, and left with my suitcase. This is how it began. I'm traveling while my daughter-in-law's 25 relatives came for Christmas. That sentence is the headline people would write later if they had to make a tidy one. There is a simplicity to it that hides everything that led to that moment. The small erasures, the whispered apologies I gave myself, the long nights of washing china at 2 a.m. while others watched television upstairs. The title tells you the choice I made in the final scene. It doesn't tell you the years of accumulation that produced it. For context, Kevin and Tiffany married 5 years ago. There was love there once, real, warm, messy, and I wanted it to be real for them the way it had been for me. I wanted family around the table, the jokes that land badly and then recover, the little rituals that stitch people together. But love does not get you out of being polite about exploiting someone else's tolerance. The first Christmas after they married, Tiffany's mother came. I remember making 2 turkeys because she liked one plain, one with herbs, and then being told the turkey I had basted was too dry. Kevin called me from the den that evening and said, "Margaret, she prefers the other one," as if he were delivering the verdict of a culinary tribunal. I laughed it off because that was what you did when the young were guests and the old had the role of host. Later, when they left, someone left a casserole dish in my sink for a week. I didn't mind. I didn't want to be the grandmother who kept score. Year 2. A birthday dinner where I realized halfway through that I was the only one cleaning up. I watched cousins I barely knew leave their coats on my sofa, mark the cushions with perfume and crumbs, and go. I didn't complain. I moved silently through the house, picking up, sweeping, reminding myself of all the reasons I had for being acquiescent: respect for my son, the embarrassment of the title difficult mother-in-law, the idea that love requires small sacrifices. Year 3 brought a small escalation. Small cash loans asked for in the intimate way a person asks for sugar, like they expected you to hand it over. I had a savings account I kept for a rainy day. They asked once, twice. The first time it was coy, like a tease. Kevin said, "We can pay you back," and I believed him the way you believe a child's promise to feed their rabbit before school. I was following the script of being generous because I like to be generous, but the script slowly started to feel like a trap. You give and then you're expected to give more, and it's never acknowledged. Christmas 4. The casserole dishes were piled, the living room smelled of cinnamon and perfume, and someone asked if I could store some family heirlooms in my spare room, just for a little while. They moved boxes into my attic and left them there for months. I stopped asking where they were returning them. It was easier to keep the peace. It was easier to be that person who made sure everyone else was comfortable. By year 5, that generosity had been weaponized into expectation. Requests became instructions. My daily tasks, grocery lists, laundry logistics, favor notes scribbled on my calendar, shifted into permanent obligations. Kevin, who had always been kind, had become softer at the center. Not mean, not necessarily disloyal, but unwilling to peer too closely at the cost. Tiffany, on the other hand, had perfected a brand of casual entitlement. She had opinions about my silverware. It's old-fashioned. My curtains. Do you have them cleaned? My recipes. Mom, why do you always stick to the same menu? It was all phrased as concern. Concern is a tool when you intend to take. I remember one particular evening, January, rain on the windows, the house smelling faintly of burnt garlic from something I had tried too late to rescue. Kevin and Tiffany returned from an event smelling of something that cost more than my mortgage. They flopped on the couch and told me about plans for a trip. Tiffany asked, half in jest, "Margaret, could you keep the dog while we're away?" I said yes without thinking. The dog was my companion after Harold died. No one else in the family had the patience. That night, after they left, I stood in the middle of my spotless kitchen and felt something tighten. I realized I'd agreed to everything for so long that I could no longer tell when the favors had turned into a life designed around cleaning up after someone else's choices. You might think a woman of my age would have had a ready arsenal of righteous responses. I had once been the kind of person who spoke her mind. Life had layered on softness and compromise. I told myself I was maintaining peace. I told myself it was worth tolerating slights for the warmth of family celebrations. I told myself I wasn't the kind of woman who held grudges. Behind all of those self-soothing lies, though, was a steady accrual of small acts that chipped away at me. The final chip came in the form of an announcement that would have been laughable if it hadn't landed like a bucket of ice water. 25 relatives, Tiffany had said, as if reciting a menu item. From Miami, from the Valley, we want to plan big. Aunt Lila will bring her famous yams. There's going to be an organist. It'll be a real family Christmas. And you expect me to do... I didn't let the sentence finish because I had been practicing that moment in my head for months, every time someone left a dish by the sink, every time a coupon for something convenient slid across the counter. I didn't want to list the chores because the list was long, and given my history, everyone would assume the final tally. They would assume I would perform, then vanish back into the background, a warm shadow. That phrase, "I'm going on vacation," landed like a clean cut. It made them recalibrate. It gave Kevin something he hadn't had, a boundary. It gave Tiffany something she hadn't considered, a problem she would have to solve herself. After I had left, I sat in the lobby of the Seabird Inn, my suitcase beside me, and listened to waves. The hotel smelled faintly of lemon oil and something floral that wasn't jasmine but wanted to be. I ordered lobster thermidor because for 5 years I had been the mistress of casseroles and insulated containers, and it felt petty and essential to eat something served on a plate that didn't need reheating. The tray came steaming, absurdly elegant, and I felt something like permission as I cut into the crusted top. But the vacation wasn't impulsive. It had been a decision nurtured by months of quiet work. In the months before Tiffany's announcement about her 25 relatives, I had found a folder. It wasn't dramatic. It was a manila folder shoved behind a stack of old brochures in Kevin's office, the room where he worked from home, where he kept expense reports and a coffee cup with the logo of the company where he'd been for 15 years. I had been looking for a screwdriver because the light over the sink flickered and I couldn't reach the bulb, and I had slipped into his office because tools end up everywhere in this house. The folder was labeled with a year and some initials. The handwriting was not mine. Inside were statements, copies of correspondence, photocopied pages, and at the bottom a little plastic card that did not belong to me. There were also emails printed out, subject lines that read like attempts to lay claim, temporary arrangement, move forward with sale, urgent signature required. At first glance, it looked to me like a messy pile, bank statements with odd charges, payment requests for an account I did not recognize, and a few letters that were clearly attempts to persuade someone, me, the bank, to do something I had no memory of authorizing. I felt the immediate physical cold sensation people report when they suspect a betrayal. I put the folder back and made myself a cup of tea. The kettle hissed, and I told myself not to be hysterical, but the way my chest had dropped told me I wasn't being hysterical. Something was wrong. You tolerate a lot when you love someone. When the temperature drops inside that tolerance and you realize you've been footing bills you never knew you were footing, the ground under your feet tilts. I started small. I asked Kevin gently about a charge on his credit card. He said he'd pay it. I left it. I asked another question and he fumbled for the paperwork and apologized with that same soft look. He looked apologetic and thin, like a man trying to hold 2 wives, his wife and his mother's expectations, and failing. The pattern I began to recognize was not one of forgetfulness. It wasn't merely overspending. There were things tied to my name, requests for loans for when the sale of the house closes, bills addressed to me but with memos in writing that referenced Tiffany's plans. At this point, I could have shouted. I could have demanded the papers then and there. Instead, I did the quiet, methodical thing many women in my generation have inherited. I documented. I made copies of things I noticed. I wrote down dates. I filled a notebook with transcriptions of voicemails that sounded off. I tried to be fair. If you confront a loved one with accusations that don't hold up under scrutiny, you lose both the argument and your dignity. If you confront with a stack of organized material, you have leverage and clarity. I hired a private investigator. I know that sounds decisive and dramatic.
It's also the most boring thing, an upright professional emailing me after lunch with a brief, efficient list of findings. No evidence found of forged documents in Bank X. Transaction at Merchant Y, inconsistency noted. Attempted loan application flagged and declined by Institution Z. The PI's notes were clinical, and I liked that. They took the drama out of what could have been a he said, she said scenario. The validity of my accusations would not hinge on my memory, it would hinge on a paper trail. Valeria, Tiffany's sister, someone with training in finance who lives in Chicago, texted me out of the blue. "I thought you should see this," she wrote, and sent a screen grab of a message a creditor had sent to an address that was, by implication, mine. She'd waded in because she didn't like how air of opportunism had hovered around certain family decisions. Alejandro, an uncle who ran a small furniture business in Miami, replied to my quiet emails with blunt questions. "Are you certain?" he asked. "This is serious." Marco, a brother-in-law who had worked in real estate, offered to meet and look over documents. My inbox filled with people who were not on Tiffany's payroll and not invested in keeping her comfortable at my expense. It was the strangest kind of blessing, third-party corroboration. I took the PI's report to Robert, my lawyer. I didn't expect litigation. I expected simple things: clarity, protection, documentation of my rights in a house that had been mine longer than my son had had a driver's license. Robert is a man of few theatrics and many forms. He pulled out a leather briefcase and sat on the other side of my kitchen table like a benevolent cat. "We can protect the property," he said. "We can make changes to the will. We can restrict transfer rights. And if there is evidence of fraud, we will have a civil remedy and counsel will advise on criminal referral if necessary." He didn't promise to take Tiffany away or to publicly shame anyone. He promised what lawyers actually promise: process, formality, boundaries that would stand up in court. There is a stern comfort to legal language. It's less romantic than revenge, but far more useful. We moved money. That sentence will sound scandalous to people who think their bank accounts are public property inside a family. I am not here to brag about financial maneuvering. What I did was the only sensible adult step. I separated funds that had been informally relied upon. I closed old joint accounts, moved savings into a new secure one where I was the only signatory, and set up an appointment to amend the deeds that would make it harder to sell the house without my agreement. Robert explained the legal nuances in plain terms. He didn't say, "We'll take everything." He said, "We'll make sure you have the rights you need so that others can't leverage your home as if it were collateral for their choices."
I also did something else, smaller, but deeply satisfying. I locked the lockbox with the family silver and put the key in a drawer I had not shown anyone in years. When I was younger, keeping things tidy was not theft, it was care. Now it felt like protecting a small, stubborn part of myself. Then I left a note. Not a dramatic note, not a manifesto, just a paper on the hall table, the kind of thing I might have written as a reminder. Back Tuesday, house as is. It had my name and a telephone number where I could be reached, because I am not a stranger. I am harsh, but fair. I wanted the note to be a clear fact. I had chosen to be away. I was not running. I was stepping into a pause I had earned. Before I left, I canceled the cleaning service for that week. That was the part that made Tiffany blanch when she read the text. "Margaret, they were scheduled," she fussed on the phone. "We had 13 beds to make." I said, "Then start making them. Practice for your guests." She didn't like that practical tone. She floundered on the other end and asked Kevin to smooth it out. I packed quietly. I took 2 dresses, a sweater I liked, a book of short stories for the dark hours. I packed the small things that feel like you when you don't want to be everyone else's mother for a few days. I left the rest, my pots, my pans, my opinions, because those had to remain in the house for practical reasons, and because I wanted the people coming to understand, in a practical way, what hosting 25 people actually entailed. On the drive to the Seabird Inn, my phone started to behave like a percussive instrument. Voicemails popped in quick succession. The first was Kevin, soft, apologetic. "Mom, maybe you shouldn't." I didn't listen to him beyond his opening words. The second was Tiffany, a string of exclamation points masquerading as reason. "We can't manage 25 people without you. They expect your turkey." The third was a text from Valeria. "I read the PI report. Call me when you arrive."
At the hotel, I ordered the lobster and poured chilled Sauvignon Blanc I had never allowed myself to drink in the living room of my house because someone might object to the glass water ring on my antique table. Here, the glass would be replaced. The tray came with a glossy menu suggesting decadences I had not felt permitted to choose for myself in years. I ate slowly, savoring the crust and the creamy sauce. Each bite felt like a small revolution. At night, I slept the kind of sleep that feels like healing, deep, uninterrupted, and slightly guilty. In the morning, I put on earrings I had not worn in a decade, sat by the window that looked out on the salt-sifted beach, and read my emails. There were 3 new ones of note. One was from Alejandro. I'm leaving tonight. Can't be in the dark about family matters. One was from Marco. If there's anything that needs legal attention, tell me.
I've seen a few things in my line of work. I don't like crooked attempts to push people out of homes. The last was from Valeria. I'm flying tomorrow. Someone needs to hold the mirror up. I felt, strangely, not elated as much as steady. There's a difference. Elation is noisy and bright. Steadiness is the hum after the oven door shuts and the kitchen begins to cool. I had done the adult things: documents, meetings, transfers. The rest would be what it was. Then my phone began to sound like a bell. Messages turned into voicemails. The hotel's concierge knocked gently and handed me a slip. "We received a delivery for you," she said. "It's from a pie company." I had, in fact, ordered a pie the night before, because some habits stick. I like pecan pie at Christmas time. The slip read, "Order received, 23 pies for delivery tomorrow." I laughed until I realized it was not from me. Someone had placed an order in my name to my home address: 23 pies, 3 china sets, an inflatable snowman. It was the kind of well-intentioned absurdity that speaks to someone planning a large housebound event without checking the household's capacity. When I called the house, the answering machine flashed. No new messages. That was not true. My phone stuck with me, though. I listened to the messages from Kevin and Tiffany at length. Kevin sounded nervous. Tiffany sounded like a person who had misread the world. "Mom," Tiffany said on one, "I've texted everyone. Aunt Lila is canceling if we can't have the table. Please." There were other messages. A delivery driver leaving a voicemail about a huge order at my address, panting through the phone as if he had climbed stairs and was tired. A neighbor, Mrs. Donnelly, calling to say she had seen cars lined up in the lane and thought maybe there was a celebration. She asked with the quiet curiosity of a woman who had watched the household change the way the tide changes sand, "Is everything all right?" I didn't ask for this kind of attention. And yet, sitting there in the faux luxury of the Seabird Inn, I felt the shape of it. 25 relatives arriving, my home expected to perform without its longtime steward, and me deliberately absent. The choice was not abandonment in the way people imagine. It was a refusal to be taken for granted. It was the difference between being needed and being used. When the first frantic text from Tiffany came, "They're arriving early, we need the house," all caps, I paused. The plan had always been for me to return on Christmas Eve with Robert and with Alejandro, Valeria, and Marco. I had set the stage not for spectacle, but for a sober, legal, and emotional reckoning. We would present the evidence, and the people responsible would have the chance to explain themselves in front of family. I wanted nothing theatrical, no banners, no shouting matches. I wanted facts and consequences. Yet, civilization has a way of collapsing into improvisation when enough people show up with expectations. Tiffany, unused to doing the heavy lifting, had assumed I would fill the gap. Kevin, unused to confrontation, had assumed I would silently go back to it. The relatives, many of them from out of state, had assumed someone older, someone familiar, would be the hub. Now the hub was out of town. The ship's captain had left the wheel to others. The question became whether absence would force those guests to recalibrate their expectations, or whether they would simply improvise around vacancy and see no change. My phone kept buzzing. The private investigator had sent a short professional message. "I've confirmed additional correspondence that suggests attempts to reassign ownership interests without full signatures. Recommend holding on any transfers until council reviews." Robert had sent a terse text. "Be ready to return Tuesday. We'll coordinate with the family." There was something delicious in the propriety of that line, "Be ready to return Tuesday," but I also saw the room in which the play would be performed. I understood that my absence was not only a boundary, but a test. Would they manage when I did not unilaterally solve their logistic crises? Would Kevin step up? Would Tiffany actually arrange the ovens? Would it be a disaster? Part of me, candidly, wanted it to be a little chaotic. Not because I enjoyed anyone's discomfort, but because sometimes people learn more from the inconvenience of their own making than from any polite lecture.
The first night at the hotel, I walked the shoreline and listened to people singing from a distance, carols, muffled and tuneless. I felt no festive twinge, not exactly. What I felt was a long, slow exhale. Being a caretaker had been my identity for a long time. That identity is snug, like an old sweater. You forget it no longer fits until you put it in the suitcase and walk away from the mirror. I slept with a small knot of anticipation in my stomach. The next morning, messages piled up. I skimmed them. We can't find the gravy boat. There's a guest coming with a cat. Can you authorize someone to get extra keys cut? Each one was a little thing that in our house had once reflexively landed on my shoulders. Now they landed in my inbox like birds on a wire, waiting to see who would feed them. I asked myself, for the 100th time in the weeks leading up to this, whether I was being petty. I thought of Harold and how he would have handled it. He would have made a plan, he would have enlisted others, he would have told stories to make the work lighter. But Harold also wouldn't have allowed people to use our home as a staging ground for their entitlement. He believed in boundaries. That is why I was surprised to find myself feeling, simultaneously, liberated and lonely. I called Valeria. "Are you sure you want to come?" I asked. "I'm flying tonight," she said without hesitation. "You don't have to fight this alone." "I wasn't planning to fight," I said.
I was planning to present facts and let the family choose. There's a difference between choosing and being conned into choosing the easier way, she replied. Someone needs to be clear. Someone needs to show the paper trail. You're good with paper, I said, smiling despite the tension. She laughed, quick and sharp. I am, and I'm sick of things being done on the assumption that older women will take care of the fallout. She was right. There is a cultural assumption that a mother will absorb inconvenience and sorrow like a sponge. People like us get commemorative plaques, for all you do, and then we are expected to do more. As the afternoon bled into evening, my messages increased. Someone sent a photo of my pantry, open shelves, empty where I had kept special things, a few packages of paper plates on the counter. Another photo, a stack of matching napkins in bright red, labeled with a post-it that said, "From Aunt Leela." It was an inventory of both supplies and assumptions. There was a line in the PI's report that chilled me more than the rest. Attempts to secure signatures for transfer or authorization are ongoing but incomplete. It meant someone had been trying to move pieces, to set up a future without the owner in the room. The audacity of that was something to behold, planning the metamorphosis of a family home without the consent of the person whose life had been inside it the longest. I sat back in my chair at the hotel and looked at the ocean. I thought of Christmases past and the way love had both sheltered and silenced me. I thought of the ways younger generations sometimes assume elders will keep doing the work because it is easier that way. I thought of forgiveness, of how it can become complicity when it is never acknowledged. That night, the phone never stopped. Voicemails came like small urgent birds. I listened to a few. One from a delivery man. 12 voices on a group thread trying to allocate cooking duties. Kevin soundlessly apologizing in the background of one message while Tiffany took charge in another. I put the phone down and read through the PDF Robert had emailed, the legal outline of the protective steps we planned to execute when I returned. It was sober and practical. Changes to account signatories, amendment to the deed, documentation ready for a potential civil suit. It was not dramatic. It was armor. On the third morning, I woke to a message from Marco. Arriving in an hour. Bring whatever proof you have. He sent no niceties, just the bluntness of a man who has spent time dealing with property and contracts. Alejandro wrote, "I'm here. Let's not let it get ugly." Valeria texted a flight itinerary. They were the cavalry, in the most ordinary sense, a handful of relatives who were not part of Tiffany's clan, but who had no tolerance for what they'd seen on paper. At mid-morning, when the tide was out and the hotel smelled of lemon, I heard a sound that made me sit up, a recording of my house's doorbell sent by a neighbor. In the video, cars were lining the lane, people were carrying boxes, and a woman, likely one of Tiffany's relatives, was asking loudly where she should put her coat. Someone else had plugged in a string of lights. The house looked like a place collaging itself into an event without its steward. For a moment, I felt a childlike glee at the chaos. There is a peculiar satisfaction when people have to perform the tasks you've been doing for years. The linens fold differently when done by those who haven't watched them dry in the sunlight for decades. The turkey will burn, perhaps, or the gravy will be too thin. But satisfaction is a selective emotion. It can be tethered to cruelty if you let it. I refrained from relishing the discomfort. I wanted my family to learn. I didn't want anyone to be humiliated. Messages turned into calls. Kevin left a voicemail that was longer than the rest, hesitant and tender. "Mom," he said, "can you come back?
I'm trying, but I don't know what to do. I can't lose you. His voice was raw. I sat with that for a long time. There were so many versions of Kevin. My small child with skinned knees, the man who brought me flowers on our anniversary, the son who had been raised with decency. And there was the man who watched entitlement blossom without stepping in. He was not wholly culpable, and I could see his fear. I wanted to comfort him, to fix it for him, to be the person who made everything right with a casserole. But I knew that if I immediately leapt back into the role of fixer, nothing would change. I had to show him another way. There was an audible shift on the house video when someone realized that dinner plates would have to be disposable. It is a small thing, the swap from porcelain to paper, but it is symbolic. Porcelain says permanence, ongoing rituals, someone tending to special things. Paper says someone has decided cleanup will be quick and leave no trace. It was a metaphor I hadn't planned, but it arrived all the same. By noon, the first batch of relatives had arrived. They were bright-faced and excited, balancing gift bags and stories. Someone had already put up a banner, "Welcome Family." It seemed like a promising idea until you remembered who would have taken care of the battery-powered lights and where one keeps the ladder to hang such things. In the video, people wandered the rooms with the kind of indecision that comes when a familiar map is missing its cartographer. My phone lit up with messages from Robert. "Hold firm. Wait for us. Do not sign anything." He was brief and firm. The lawyer's voice in text form made the world smaller and safer. It was a legal anchor, and I trusted it. I ordered another glass of wine and looked out at the gray horizon.
I had chosen to leave, to travel, while my daughter-in-law's 25 relatives came for Christmas, because I wanted them to feel the weight of hosting the way I had for years. I had also chosen to leave because I had gathered evidence and arranged for a sober, structured confrontation that would not be a spectacle, but a necessary accounting. There was no doubt the morning would bring drama. There would be calls, perhaps tears, certainly some anger. But drama is not the same as justice. I wanted the latter. When the hotel's front desk handed me a small envelope with a handwritten note, "We kept a plate for you," I smiled in a way that surprised me. Small gestures matter. They are the stitches that repair what years of neglect unmake. That afternoon, I sat on the balcony and made a list on a napkin of things we would present. The PI summary, the correspondence, the bank printouts that didn't belong to me, the notes on attempts to shift ownership. I wrote them like a checklist for someone trying to build a case, and in that precise, ordinary way, I felt less afraid. I wasn't a woman holding a grudge. I was a woman gathering facts. The house video made its way through the family groups. People texted, "Is Margaret okay? Why did she leave? Is this about money?" The narrative spun. The temptation to correct it was strong. I typed short replies. "I'm fine. Back Tuesday with counsel." It was enough for some, not enough for others. By late afternoon, the sun leaned low. The cousins had begun arguing about seating arrangements. Someone put up a sign indicating kids' table, and one of the aunts laughed. "Finally, the kids won't eat underfoot." The house looked alive in a way that had warmth and also the strain of improvisation. I poured myself another slice of the hotel lemon cake and felt my pulse settle. I had not intended to leave the arc unresolved, but most real stories resist neat closure. There was and remains the tectonic moment approaching. Family members arriving who had been informed of the facts I had sent, a lawyer arriving to make formal the protections I had taken, and a son whose allegiance would be asked in a way that could not be answered with silence. For now, the seabirds' waves were my soundtraft. In a matter of hours, I would decide whether to return sooner than planned or to let the week play out until Robert and our assembled witnesses could be present. The decision felt like a hinge on the door of a house I had stewarded for decades. If you are wondering what it felt like to be that woman, traveling while my daughter-in-law's 25 relatives came for Christmas, know this: it was not triumphant in the way some imagine. It was deliberate, careful, fearful at times, and brave in the way of small, repeated acts. It was choosing to stop being the default fixer and becoming the person who asks for accountability. It was, in the end, the quiet accumulation of small refusals until one refusal became a boundary. As the evening darkened and the house video shifted to grainier footage, I made tea and sat with the napkin list. My phone beeped with a new message. "They're here. It's chaos. Can you come back?" It was Kevin. I let the phone sit face down. My suitcase was zipped. The lobster thermidor tray had been cleared. The tide sang like something patient and unbothered. I thought about the arrival of Alejandro and Valeria, about Robert with his briefcase, about the formalities that would follow. I thought about Kevin's voice, small and pleading. I had come here to be away. I had come here to create a space where the household would have to meet their own consequences. But I had also come here to return, with witnesses, with legal authority, with the dignity I had earned, so that the reckoning would not be rumor and spectacle, but a measured, binding realignment of how things would be done in my home from this day forward. The phone buzzed again. The line of cars circled in the lane. Inside my house, people were learning how to host without me. Outside, in the hotel, the ocean kept its own rhythm. I folded the napkin, put it in my purse, and listened to the voices on the threads as they rose and fell, like a chorus building towards something inevitable. There is a moment in every difficult story when you realize you cannot control everything that will happen next. You can only choose how to stand when the door opens. When I decided to come back, it wasn't because the house was falling apart. It was because truth is not persuasive when it sits in someone's inbox. It wants to be held up where people can see it and be forced to look. I packed the napkin list into my purse, tugged on my coat, and asked the concierge to call a taxi. The Seabirds clerk wrapped my leftover lemon cake in a paper bag like it was contraband, and I carried that little theft of sweetness back to the car. The drive home was gray and slow, the interstate a ribbon of salt and wet. I thought about the first Christmas I had cooked with Harold, how he would stand at the doorway with his arms folded and compliment the stuffing like he was naming one of our children. He would have liked that the truth was arriving on time and by appointment. He would not have liked that the scene had to be public at all. I ambled through those memories the way one fingers a stone in a pocket. They steadied me. Robert called halfway through my trip. He was calm in the manner that lawyers are trained to be, tone even, vocabulary limited to words like document, custody of records, temporary injunction, phrases that were not about shame but about structure. He said, "We will meet at the house. Alejandro and Marco are en route. Valeria is on a later flight but will be present for the meeting. Bring nothing else. Speak the facts. Let us read the documents aloud." "Will the police be involved?" I asked.
If we have evidence of identity misuse, the next step could be referral, but that is not ours to declare in front of everyone, he said. We present the facts. The rest follows. When I pulled into my lane, it was not like the videos had shown in all ways. I had expected to find an unmade bed in the guest room and a stack of pie boxes. I had expected confusion and perhaps a bit of triumph in the faces of people who thought they'd gotten away with something. Instead, the street looked ordinary, the wreaths on the neighbors' doors casting little enameled circles in the dull light. Cars were indeed parked in a line like a small festival, and when I stepped out and closed the taxi door, I heard high voices and the clatter of being 10 people short of organization. A woman I did not know was carrying a roll of paper tablecloths and talking about napkin colors like it was the most urgent decision on earth. At the front door, a cousin I had met once extended a hand and said, "Mrs. Hollis, I'm Lisa. Are you feeling all right? We didn't know you'd be gone." "I'm fine," I said, and I was. I'm back now. Inside, the house looked like a venue hastily dressed. Strings of battery lights hung 3 different colors because someone couldn't decide. A punch bowl, plastic, sat on the sideboard with a ladle that had clearly not been sanitized. Paper plates stacked next to the china like a whisper of contempt. The pantry shelves were littered with boxes someone had ordered to supply an army, 2 giant tubs of powdered gravy mix, a case of disposable cups, 12 loaves of cheap white bread. It had a certain slapdash humility that made me sad more than furious. Kevin met me in the hallway. He hadn't shaved that morning. He looked older than his years. His eyes tried to find mine and then looked away, which was the sign of a man who'd been carrying his mother's disappointment like a parcel he didn't know how to unhand. "Mom," he said, "you came back." "I did," I said. "Robert is with me." He swallowed. He looked like a child trying to decide whether to ask permission to climb a tree. "I tried, Mom, I really did, but they kept asking where you were. Someone asked for gravy and It doesn't matter," I interrupted gently. "That's not what matters right now." We went into the parlor where voices hummed like an animal in a den. Alejandro stood by the mantel, sturdy and sun-browned in the way Cuban men who move furniture become. Marco was already in a sweater, sleeves rolled up, carrying a folder. Valeria arrived half an hour later, damp from an evening flight, and wearing a coat that said accounting with authority. There were relatives who had been told with varying degrees of detail about issues at hand. Some of them looked annoyed, some looked curious. A few had the blank expression of people who had only come for the cookies. I handed Robert a file of printed materials. He nodded and arranged the stack on the coffee table like a surgeon aligning instruments. "We will not yell," he said. "We will state the facts. I will read the investigator's summary, and then we will pass around the copies of the correspondence. Please remember, remain civil. Disagreements are not the same as lies." Valeria took a seat beside me and squeezed my hand. She did not say anything theatrical. She simply sat there like an accountant, ready to reconcile an impossible ledger. Marco muttered a curt, "I've seen worse," like a man who had spent his life combing through legal descriptions of property. Alejandro, who had sometimes favored the bluntness of men who don't like small talk, walked to the window and looked out at the lane, as if at any moment he might see a handcart of evidence roll up. Robert spoke first. He read the PI's executive summary aloud in a voice that made the words sound ordinary, the spite of their content softened by the speaker's dryness. The investigator confirmed the presence of correspondence directed to the owner regarding payment arrangements, loan inquiries, and attempted reassignment requests. Several transactions were initiated using the owner's information without her explicit authorization. There is a record of attempts to secure signatures and to process loans against the property, contingent on an alleged pending sale. He put down the paper. "We are here to show these items and to ask for a response from those whose actions appear on these documents." I had not meant for the room to silence like this. The party had been a kind of murmuring animal until that moment. Tiffany stood a few feet away, hands clenched around a folded paper napkin, cheeks flushed with the defensive heat of someone who has been cornered by an uninvited morality play. "Margaret," she began, and her voice was the practiced evenness of a person who had practiced being plausible. "This is ridiculous. There were a few conversations about people helping, about selling things that were behind. We never meant—" "You never asked me," I said, quieter than she expected, which made several people lean in. "Not one of these attempts is logged with my knowledge. There are documents here that show correspondence addressed to me for which I have no recollection of authorizing. That is not conversation. That is action." A copy of an email that Valeria had transcribed was passed around. The excerpt read, "We need to move forward with sale. Owner agreeable pending her signature. Can we expedite? T." Another printout showed a creditor notice addressed to Margaret, but referencing a loan application that included details about a planned sale. There were bank transaction annotations that, while redacted to prevent any divulgence of sensitive specifics, clearly placed amounts in memos as if someone had tried to book a future outlay against the house. Tiffany's face changed from defensiveness to something that had the crease of panic.
"I never forged anything," she said. "I asked, I called, I wrote emails." "You wrote to whom?" Marco asked. "Did you actually reach a creditor with requests?" Her eyes flicked to Kevin. He said nothing. Valeria's voice, when she spoke, was low and surgical. "There are message headers indicating attempts to initiate applications. Some are incomplete, but several are detailed enough to show a plan. I don't like to be dramatic, but in finance, you don't plan a sale by asking politically. You produce paperwork. There was paperwork attempted." "It is one thing to ask for help," Alejandro said, "and another to attempt to use another's name or to plan a transfer without informing them. Where does the assumption come from that someone's home is currency for your aspirations?" A cousin of Tiffany's, a woman named Martha, stood up defensively. "We didn't know," she said, and she sounded small. "We came for family. We didn't come to judge." We all breathed. That was the trouble with family. Some people took offense when facts suggested their hospitality might have been conditioned on someone else's labor. It unsettled their moral ledger. Robert laid out the legal actions we were implementing. "We have executed temporary restrictions on transfers of title. The cause is to protect the legal rights of the owner while we investigate the documentation. We will not be making arrests today. We will be asking relevant institutions to freeze discussions of transfer until proper representation is present. There will be no immediate evictions. This is to preserve order while we determine whether misconduct has occurred." The word freeze produced a small wave in the room. Tiffany looked like a person who had suddenly been told ice would not merely cool her beverage but swallow her plans. "Is this—" Kevin started. "It is legal precaution," Robert said. "It is a standard remedial step." Tiffany's side of the relatives gathered. Hands rose, questions were asked. Some people were appalled at Tiffany's apparent audacity. Others were confused. "But isn't this a misunderstanding?" one woman asked. Maybe there was miscommunication." A copy of a charge ledger was then passed to the relatives, small print and terse notations. I could see some of their faces shift as if they were watching a movie where someone else had been the villain all along. Some of them muttered apologies to me. Others looked at Tiffany with a dawning comprehension that their hostess had more agency, more discretion than they'd assumed. Tiffany made a defiant effort. "I only ever wanted to keep things afloat," she said. "Our family needed help. I asked and tried to get signatures. Maybe I was aggressive, but I wasn't trying to—" "You may be right that you were trying to keep things afloat," Valeria interrupted, and there was a wire in her voice that had nothing to do with familial politeness. "But keeping things afloat doesn't include acting on behalf of someone without their permission. When you attempt to use another person's credit or name, that is not a question of thoroughness, it's a question of authorization." Kevin finally spoke. He had avoided the center of the room like a shield, but now he moved forward slowly as though the air had been made of glass. "Mom," he said, and his voice broke on the second syllable. "I didn't know. I really didn't. If I had—" "You did," someone in the room said, and it was not a malicious voice. Marco stated it simply. "The documents were on your desk." Kevin flinched. His face went vacant. "I work long hours," he said. "I left things at your desk sometimes. I didn't expect—" "Kevin," I said, and though I wanted to be tender, the room needed clarity, and his doubt could not be allowed to revert to comfort. There were emails, there were notations. You cannot say you didn't see them, and also say you cared. It is not either or. You were here, and you chose inaction. Do you understand what that costs?" There was a long, painful exhale. He nodded as if agreeing with me about weather. "I do," he said finally. "I should have looked. I should have protected you. I'm sorry." His apology was not a magic wand. It was not a guarantee of changed behavior, but it was a start of owning the fact that he had a role in the dynamic, not only as a son, but as a partner in household governance. Some things must be given time to heal, and contrition can begin that process. Tiffany's defense then shifted to a different tack, practical need. "We are trying to have a life," she said. "We are trying to raise a household. Sometimes you make choices under pressure." I thought, "And when you thought, you acted without asking the owner?" Alejandro said. There was no flourish in his voice, only a man who felt boundaries had been ignored, speaking up. Tiffany's eyes filled. She said, "I regret it. I'll make it right." Robert spoke again. "Regret is not a momentary balm for actions that have legal implications. However, it is also not our role to shred this into a public spectacle. The first step is restitution where possible, and adjustments to access and authority. We will require that any future financial steps be accompanied by written authorization from the owner. We will set up a meeting with the relevant financial institutions to cut off any attempts to process transfers. We will require Tiffany to provide full disclosure of communications and to cooperate with an audit." There was a hush that felt like the congregation before a stern but necessary homily. For a while, no one spoke. Then, unexpectedly, Aunt Leela, the woman famous for yams, came forward and wrapped me in an embrace. "I didn't know," she whispered into my coat. "I'm sorry." It was small and soft. The room loosened a bit. People began to move around, rearranging themselves into the new shape the facts had asked them to assume. Some stood with folded arms. Some left the room to make calls. A few cried. I did not cry then. The demands of the moment required a certain reservoir of composure. Robert outlined the steps he was taking in plain, accessible language, so that even those without legal training could follow. "We will amend the will to be precise about who can act on your behalf. We will record a notice with the registry that none of the parties should take actions without your express written consent. We will collect statements that confirm these attempts to process transfers. Finally, we will draft a repayment agreement for those transactions that can be identified and proven." He slid a summary across to me. The paper had a practical, unromantic warmth. It felt like armor. Tiffany's face looked battered by the clarity of the net closing. She glanced at Kevin with a plea that seemed to say, "We can get through this together." Kevin met her gaze but did not touch her. The lack of touch was a small image that said more than any speech. He understood the harm done and could not simply wrap it in his body like a blanket. At dinner that night, if you could call it that, it was more of an urgent improvisation. The relatives had ordered pizza because the ovens were proving tricky under hands that did not know their idiosyncrasies. Pizza boxes unfolded on the table next to a stack of paper plates, and a note in my handwriting someone had left open. "Back Tuesday, house as is." I did not care for the pizza much. It was fine for the people who had come to be together. I ate a small salad and found that I could not taste it the way I might have in years past, when my role as cook had been a quiet, defining engine of my happiness. This was not about food. It was about what the household meant. Valeria sat beside me and said quietly,
I've gone through the bank statements. There are items that can be traced, but some are in a morass. We can work through them. For now, make clear who has access. Let us do the tedious thing." "It's tedious and important," I said. She smiled a little. "Like sweeping behind a party after midnight." "Exactly." The night was punctuated by whispered conversations and the sound of dishes being assembled in an unfamiliar way. I heard Kevin somewhere in the house say, "I'll do the dishes." It surprised me. Later that evening, I stood by the sink watching him fold napkins with uncertain hands, and there was something in me that wanted to step forward to teach him how to fold them the right way. Instead, I let him find his own pattern. It was a kindness that felt strange and necessary both. In the days that followed, the family's shape altered. Some of Tiffany's relatives left early, embarrassed by the discovery of things they had never meant to be tied to. Some stayed, choosing to support her despite the evidence.
Alejandro, Marco, and Valeria remained like sentries, practical and quiet. They sat with me at the kitchen table and helped sort through stacks of capers, printing statements, redacting unnecessary details, and preparing documentation for the banks. In their presence, the work felt less like revenge and more like reclamation. The private investigator provided a fuller report. Attempts to process certain applications had been dropped when the required verification failed. Notes suggested that there had been verbal misrepresentations made to institutions about pending permissions. I cannot describe the technical minutiae, nor do I want to, but the tone of the report made clear there had been purposeful attempts to create consensus where none existed. The PI concluded with a cautionary remark. The paper trail suggests intent to mislead, but further corroboration from third-party institutions would be required to establish criminal intent. I appreciated the restraint of those sentences. They kept open the possibility of accountability without becoming a theater of accusation. There was one moment, an evening where the light slanted across the living room and made the dust look like suspended stars, when Tiffany and I sat across from each other and said nothing for a long time. I thought to make a speech. Instead, I looked at her and saw a woman in her 30s who had grown up with different pressures, of image, of urgency, of needing to secure a future at the cost of other people's certainty. I saw a person who had hunger enough to make her foolish. I saw also a person who had to be held responsible. "I never wanted to hurt you," she said at last, voice small. "I know," I answered, "but the intention doesn't erase the effect." She put her face in her hands and wept. It was not dramatic. It was small and human. Kevin stood nearby and did not know whether to cross the room, to be the man who would hold her, or to respect the space that had been violated. He chose in the end to stand without touching. That choice felt like a modest, complicated kind of loyalty, to his mother and to his roles. We set out the practical measures. Tiffany agreed, however reluctantly, to a schedule for restitution for the specific items we could prove caused a financial drain. We agreed that any further decisions about the house, gifting, selling, writing checks that could be construed as transfer of interest, would be subject to a written process with my explicit signature. Robert drafted a short addendum to the household rules that read more like a contract than a ritual. No financial decisions affecting ownership or title shall be made without the express written authorization of the owner. It was not elegant, but it worked. Some of the relatives left with apologies. Some stayed and helped unpack a different kind of holiday, one where the table was set, but the assignments were explicit. For instance, Alejandro took charge of the turkey, a man with hands used to moving couches, but who managed to baste with the grace of someone who had once watched his mother in a kitchen. Marco organized a roster for cleaning, an idea he proposed that made people groan in a way that felt human and restorative. Valeria put envelopes on the counter labeled receipts and instructed people on how to keep them. There was a new choreography to the house that, if it lacked the old fluid kindness, had the compensating benefit of fairness. The legal measures had a quiet gravity. The registry's notice meant that banks would not process an application presented by someone without me in the room. Robert worked with institutions patiently, explaining, documenting, asking for holds where appropriate. When the bank representative said, "We're sorry this happened," he said it like a clerk offering condolence to someone who'd been pickpocketed, polite, not transformative, but necessary. There was a curious aftermath that surprised me. Tiffany did not immediately leave. She chose to stay in the house, and that was both brave and complicated. I had to think through what that meant for the daily life we would have to reconstruct. Kevin slept in our room for a while instead of with Tiffany, an arrangement that had its own gravity, And slowly, with the tangible scaffolding we had put up, some of the heat cooled. It was not healing like a bandage, it was healing like the slow setting of plaster. Around New Year, there was an independent conversation, private and careful, about therapy. A cousin who worked in nonprofit mental health offered to find a counselor. The suggestion was met with a mixture of relief and resistance. Rehabilitation, whether personal or relational, is messy and takes time. I welcomed the idea because I had needed all along a way to translate the odd creeping breakdown of boundaries into a possibility for learning. As weeks turned into months, the household settled into its new pattern. I had the keys to the safe wardrobe of documents and a bank account with my name as the only signatory. That autonomy did not make me a fortress. It made me able to say no without trembling. It made me able to accept co-responsibility in a healthier way. Kevin worked with Marco and Alejandro on a payment schedule for the outstanding items, and though the sums were not trivial, they were manageable, repayments crafted with counsel so they would not become new forms of pressure. There were losses, friendships frayed. There were relatives who stopped visiting because they viewed my insistence on boundaries as unkind. There were holidays afterward that felt quieter. Loneliness is an honest cost of claiming your space, and I will not pretend it was absent. Sometimes at night, I slept in a house where the echo of my own footsteps sounded too sharp. Sometimes I thought I had chosen a kind of exile.
And yet, expatriation of the old dependencies gave me a clarity I had not thought I wanted. I learned in the months after how to do small, pleasurable things that were not acts of penance or performance for others. I bought new tea because the old tin had been given to someone who needed a token. I took myself to a museum and lingered in front of a painting until I understood its color. I rejoined a group at the library, women knitting, some ancient, some new, and found that there was immense wisdom in sitting in a room knitting a row without the expectation that it meant anything except the pleasure of the stitch. The acts were small, but their accumulation transformed how the days felt. There were also moments of tenderness that surprised me. One Sunday, Kevin made scrambled eggs for breakfast without asking. They were slightly too salty, but he had opened the blinds to let light in. That day, he and I sat and read letters from Harold. We laughed at his bad poetry and cried at a line where he'd promised to travel with me to Norfolk. Kevin did not need my forgiveness to be whole. He needed guidance and presence. Forgiveness is a process, not a pronouncement. Tiffany and I did not become friends overnight. We had the stances of two people who had been close enough to hurt each other with the ease of familiarity. But we had repeated small conversations about a recipe she wanted to learn, about how to fold napkins in a way that did not crease them like a map. We helped each other in practical ways that were the infrastructure of civility. She watered my plants when I had to be away for a week. I showed her how the furnace thermostat worked. Those small exchanges did not erase what had happened, but they created a template for living together with honesty. Legally, the house remained mine. There were formalities that need not be spelled out here. There was paperwork signed and filed and stamped. The main change was that I was no longer a passive hinge in family decision-making. We had established processes for financial transparency, and those processes curtailed a certain kind of opportunism that had once seemed normal in our home. The result was less gleam and more governance, but it was also safer. One afternoon several months later, when the holidays had become a musculature of routine, Alejandro invited us all to his house in Miami for a late January lunch. "Let's not make everything a contest of ownership," he said. "Let's eat." We drove through a mild rain. The weather in Florida felt like a promise that seasons can reverse. At Alejandro's, we gathered not as a court, but as a family still in progress. Tiffany made a small speech, not dramatic, not penned by anyone else, but honest. She acknowledged mistakes and talked about wanting to do better. Her words were not an absolution, they were an offering. People accepted it with cautious relief. Marco toasted with orange soda because he said he was trying to cut back on liquor.
Valeria laughed in that way that means something like surface and depth in the same breath. Kevin held my hand across the table for a second, and I squeezed back. There were moments I missed the old ease, the way the holidays had used to fold around me with certainty. Those moments were not regret so much as nostalgia, an ache that honored the person I had been who loved to feed. But nostalgia is brittle if you live inside it. It must be held gently and not mistaken for current satisfaction. I also learned to travel without hauling guilt on my shoulders. It's a small skill,
to leave your house and accept that it will not collapse, and that if it does, there will be systems and people to manage it. I took another short trip in the spring, brief and intentional. The house hummed in my absence without catastrophe. Kevin left a note in my handwriting reminding me to water the fern. It was both banal and exquisite. The final settlement, a legal closure of sorts, came weeks later when Robert sat with me and explained the essential outcome. "We have reached a civil agreement for restitution on identified items," he said. "We have recorded the deed restrictions. There will be ongoing monitoring, and if any additional irregularities emerge, counsel will recommend next steps." He did not say everything was fixed. He said it was protected. That was the closest thing to absolution I needed. On the eve of the next Christmas, I stood in the kitchen and set out one of the china plates. I had reintroduced the china slowly, like allowing a pet back into the house after some misbehavior. It was a modest ceremony. 1 plate, 1 fork, 1 candle. The household had rituals now that were collaborative and explicit. There would be volunteer rosters for cooking and cleaning. There would be financial boundaries. There would be conversations about expectations. That year, Tiffany's children, our grandchildren, ran around with silly hats, and there was noise like a small orchestra playing without a conductor. At one point, I walked to the window and watched them chase the paper star. I felt something like a foothold in the world. I think the most important change was not legal. It was the shape of how we spoke to one another. People learned to ask. Some learned to wait for the answer. Some still pushed against it. That is human. But the pivot toward asking and away from assuming was a small revolution. Sometimes I still thought about the lobster. The memory of the Seabird Inn, of the tray and the creamy sauce, had the hold of a small indulgence that felt like protest at the time, purely personal and perfectly righteous. Once, while reorganizing the cutlery drawer, I found a napkin with the hotel's name scribbled on it, a keepsake I'd tucked away. I smiled. I had traveled while my daughter-in-law's 25 relatives came for Christmas, and that act had been a hinge. When I tell the story now, I tell it as a woman who reclaimed the way her home had been treated.
I tell it without triumphalism, because what I had done was not war, but tidy, exacting defense. I had put papers where assumptions used to be. I had enlisted attorneys and a private investigator, not to create spectacle, but to make sure that the facts could breathe in plain air. That is how we moved from accusation to accounting. In the years since, the house has its own rhythm again. There are holidays where everything is ornate and perfect, and there are small meetings where nothing is perfect at all. Both feel honest. I am learning, slowly, to let the younger people find their own patterns while holding to my own terms. The work of boundaries is a daily thing, not a drama. Sometimes, late at night, I think about the other women who might be quietly the stage hands of large families, women whose labor is invisible week to weekday. I think about how small documents and a willingness to insist on one's own rights can alter the axis of an entire household. It is not glamorous. It is necessary. If you ask me whether I regret traveling that week, I'll tell you this. I regret the years of silence that enabled the assumptions, but I do not regret the suitcase. Leaving was not an escape. It was a strategic pause. It allowed others to meet the consequences of choices they had made for themselves. It allowed facts to enter the room in a way conversation alone never could. On the first anniversary of that Christmas, Kevin put his arm around my shoulder and said, "You made us look at ourselves." He said it like a man who knew he had been partial to avoidance and was trying, stumblingly, to be better. I will close by saying what I said then in the lobby of the Seabird Inn. I am traveling while my daughter-in-law's 25 relatives come for Christmas. It was the headline, the literal truth, and the hinge upon which a small, necessary reckoning turned. The house is still mine, but more importantly, the rules are clear. I sleep better. I cook when I want to cook. I say no when no is called for. This was my Christmas. What would you have done?